welcome back for another episode of Jason's Game Room, the only podcast here on YouTube that covers everything gaming, from board games to dice games to CCGs to video games. Hell, I even talked about Pog on last week's show. If it's gaming, it's here. You're going to want to keep tuning in and listening and seeing what's new. Now, getting down to business, on today's show, I want to talk to you about miniatures, and more specifically where they're used and how they're used. Now, that being said, the two biggest games that you're going to see miniatures used in are Dungeons & Dragons and primarily Warhammer 40,000. If you're not familiar with Warhammer 40,000, it's a huge tabletop game. Players take a lot of time in creating miniature sets for their miniature figures. There's a lot of painting and detailing, and it's based on taking over territory, building armies, and waging war. Whereas if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, most of that is done on a notepad with a pencil and paper, but you do use the odd miniature as your player as you're moving around whatever map or board you've created. And I am one of those people that is fascinated by miniatures, especially when it comes to the more science fiction tabletop games like some of the Star Wars and Star Trek games. Unfortunately, I've never had enough money to go into miniatures. I'm not sure if I would ever play the full game. I've always been interested in buying some blank miniatures and painting them myself and just putting them on display. But one of the big issues with getting into tabletop games that deal with miniatures is there is a lot of money involved. If you think CCGs are expensive, especially the way I've talked about them on previous episodes, miniatures are a whole new ballgame. And I'll give you an example. A starter deck in a CCG will cost you $10-12, and a booster pack, well, booster packs used to be $2-3, but they're like $4 or $5 now. So a starter and 3 or 4 boosters is going to run you about $25, give or take, plus tax. Whereas a single miniature can cost anywhere from $30 to about $60, depending on who makes it and the amount of detail put into the miniature. Then you have to buy your paints and supplies, and you have to also start building sets for the miniatures to go on the table when you're playing the game. And you're also making the tabletop portion, which is the landscape and the trails, and you're adding your buildings and your structures and your miniatures. And when all is said and done, it is a huge, huge undertaking that requires a ton of money. Miniatures and Warhammer 40,000 to a lesser extent, it costs more to build a layout for that than it did with my model railroad. And I've spent a good amount of money on my model railroad over the past 10 years I've had it going, but anything done with miniatures would eclipse that easily. And if you're surprised, don't be. Just go into any hobby store near you that sells supplies for miniatures and Warhammer and D&D or the Star Wars game, and you'll see how expensive it becomes. Like just picture 4 figures unpainted. That could be $160 to $200 right there, and that doesn't even get you a start. Now, that being said, I'm not knocking miniatures or Warhammer 40,000 or anything like that. There is a hobby store in town in one of the malls that has a game room set up, and when I do go into that mall, which is not very often, but I like going past his store and looking at the tables set up for gameplay, because the amount of work put in is just stunning, and it's always neat to see that level of dedication from players of those games. Whereas if you're like me and you're a primarily CCG player, we've put in our own years of dedication by buying the cards, keeping on top of the boosters, storage options, plastic sleeves, etc., etc. But it goes even further for players of Warhammer 40,000 and all those other miniature games, because not only do they have to have some sort of small setup of their own at home, but they have to have places to store all the figures, vehicles, landscapes, paints, paintbrushes, supplies. Anyone that knows me and has seen my desk and my supply shelf, that would have to be 5-fold for anyone doing miniatures, because you need a lot of stuff. And it's just wow. It really is insane, the level of dedication and detail needed for that. And that brings me to another interesting facet of miniatures, is that how many of the smaller comic book stores and card shops, they still do paint nights for miniatures. There's a small town about 15 minutes from here called Elmvale, and there's a small comic store there. And he seems to do a miniature paint night, I think once every 2 weeks. I could be mistaken. And I think that's neat because, if anything, one of the best parts that I think miniatures and games like that have to offer is the creativity level. And I think as a society, we always want to keep that creativity going, and we want those juices to keep flowing so that people can express themselves. And miniatures is a good way to do that. I used to work with a guy, and I've mentioned him before on this show, and he bought a couple miniatures not to play because, again, of the money factor, but he bought a couple to paint up, and he even brought one to work once. And the running gag that day was he was taking pictures of his little miniature in weird places around the store, and we had a good laugh, and it was kind of cool because he did a very excellent job on it. And at that time, that's what got me even more interested, because it's like, well, I have tons of paints and brushes and supplies at home for other projects like my railroad, and I could easily paint up a couple of those miniatures and join in. But again, the money factor is what did it for me, because when I saw how much those run for, it was out of my budget because I was building my railroad at the time. But even though cost can be an issue, I would encourage anyone to maybe even just buy 1 or 2 miniatures within their budget and just paint them and see what they can come up with. You never know, it might lead to something else. You might find another piece of creativity. Or even go to your local store or game store or comic store that does Warhammer nights and watch a game. There's no harm in watching a game, and you might even enjoy the gameplay and get into it. You can ask questions. A lot of the players are approachable. They're more than happy to talk about their handiwork and their detail work. So it's an interesting way to make friends and to learn about different types of gaming. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it on today's show, is because I think it's an underappreciated sector of gaming. And even though it's not one that I think of primarily, it is something that people should take note of. Like, anybody can buy a pack of cards and get into a CCG. Anybody can go buy a video game and plug it into their system. Anybody can buy a vial of dice and start playing that, or notepads and doing D&D. But miniatures is a whole different thing, and it's cool. Seriously. So get out there, go to your local card shop or game store, check it out. Have some fun. That's what it's all about. It all comes down to fun, no matter what. If you're not having fun, then what's the point? Anyways, that's all I got on today's show. I didn't want to drone on as long as I normally would about this. I just wanted to get the message out about miniatures and give you my thoughts on it, because that's what I do on this show. I give you my thoughts and opinions and sometimes news about everything gaming. And I thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell all your friends. And if you have a suggestion for an episode, please let me know in the comments below, because I am always taking suggestions for episodes. I want to know what you want to hear about on the show, and I will do my best to produce episodes that you want to hear. Have a great day, everybody. And of course, game on!